Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, a few days ago, Elon Musk was talking about the Roman Empire, and he said the Roman Empire collapsed because of lowering population. Now, in my feed, that brought out all the Rome channels that everyone knows about. We're now going in all of these in-depth Fall of Rome videos, specifically trying to like debunk or at least add a lot more nuance to that claim. And I wanted to check one out. This one is from Historian's Craft, and he just titled the video, Elon Musk Doesn't Understand Why the Roman Empire Fell. I've done some more kind of fun videos on Rome, and including Rome's fall over my originals channel. Does not go to the depth that some of these do. But if you want to check that out, check out Mr. Terry Originals. I'll link that other channel down below. This original video is going to be linked down below. Make sure you're supporting it. Let's see what they got there, and I'll tell you what I think and what I know. Here we go. By the way, years after years of having that Mr. Terry history logo, I got so like immune to it. I didn't realize how like corny it is. I have nothing in this space right here, right now, kind of by the little door basketball hoop. I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think I should put something in this part of the screen? Should we just leave it blank? You want to just see the rest of the office here? I don't know. Let me know. And if you want to make me cool, if you got some cool graphical ideas and you know how to do that stuff, let me know too.
In this video, I want to spend some time talking about, as usual with this channel, late antiquity and the end of the Western Roman Empire. Specifically, I want to address something that's been blowing up on the internet this week and that has caused something of a storm over on X.
Oh, was it not on a podcast? Because I did originally, I think, saw this tweet. No foreign policy actions can save a civilization if its population keeps dropping. Population collapse of Romans over time is what caused Rome to fall. The Romans worried about this, but failed to stop it. Now, the obvious remark is that population decline is an effect, necessarily a cause. So, of course, what is causing those types of things? There's a lot. I'm going to let the video go into a whole bunch of things, but I'll tell you a lot of the things that we talk about, academia or whatever. And I know a lot of you are Rome guys too, because you think about it every day. So we'll see what's going on. Now, the depopulation thing too, I've heard Elon Musk talk like in general. And it is always interesting because if you know him, he has a bunch of kids. He's fathered a lot of children with a bunch of different women. And I don't know if he's doing necessarily doing that because he's like, I have to do this for Earth, or it's just the thing he's into. You know what I mean? I don't know. Where do you put that into this mindset of his?
Which is this post by Elon Musk stating rather bluntly that the Roman Empire fell due to a general population collapse, which has been seen by at least 2.2 million people. There's a lot of reasons the Roman Empire collapsed. And probably more by the time that I
very slow.
This. And by the way, since this is a longer discussion, I don't really have much of a way to animate this, so you may just want to listen to it while doing something else, like playing Hearts of Iron. So... Is that
so Historian's Craft? I'm trying to remember if I've covered them before. I know I've had them recommended before, but all Hoi 4 people, are you into this channel? Should I be watching more of it? What's their big thing?
Correct. Well, there was a decline in population from the 2nd century onward, perhaps as much as a 20% decline by the 5th century. And following the 5th century, so the 500s, there was even more of a general population decline and a general abandonment of cities.
Sure. And of course, that also depends what part of the Roman Empire from, east-west split. You're going to see the east grow quite a bit, while west is not. But some things we'll see if he'll talk about. Food productivity, overcultivation of land also had impacts on that on some regions. Of course, food equals people. Yeah, by the time that at least the Western Roman Empire had fallen, you're actually talking almost probably more like it was 10% probably of the population that it once was at its height. It's over a long period of time, but it decreased significantly. But again, you're talking about effects rather than causes, right?
That much is true. And no historian or archaeologist would really ever dispute it. That being said, any attempt to explain the collapse of the western half of the Roman Empire also has to explain why the eastern half of the empire did not collapse, which is where the notion of population decline essentially just goes right out the window, never mind the fact that it is chronologically wrong.
Of course, the east becomes, the capital. It's economically very strong by trade routes, very resource rich. People go where the action is too, right? Whole lot of vulnerability in the West too, as you guys know, with the Germanic invasions. But that also brings in their military policy, which I don't know if they'll get into that as much either, but let's see. Okay.
The fall of the Western Roman Empire holds such a grip over our collective imagination because it is central to anxieties over our own civilizational health.
True.
And it's had this grip since at least the French Revolution, if not earlier.
Sure. Probably forever. I mean, there's not been an empire more imitated and referenced, especially obviously in the Western world. I mean, everybody, think how many different states or empires claim to be the successors to the Roman Empire or modeling things after them. I mean, they're the most imitated culture ever. I do think, by the way, you know how people really, when they talk about the value of learning history, the whole like history repeats itself thing and learning from past of the history. I think there is a lot of truth to that, but I also think people take that way too far. They look for heroes in history or certain events in history and think these are just one-to-one comparisons of how things will go in the modern day. In fact, you're going to find as many people trying to use what they think are good lessons in the past that aren't going to create good results as you are going to see people that use lessons of the past to have good results. But the fantasizing about historical time periods, I think, is actually quite counterproductive.
Essentially, the argument goes, if we can explain why the Roman Empire fell, then we can see warning signs of this in the present day, and then we can prevent a similar collapse of our own states.
There's a problem with that too. A lot of things that rose to their power you would not want to mimic now. The Romans were also incredibly brutal. There's societal aspects that people are not going to want to recreate with certain moral issues. So I do think people, and Rome being a big one, people cherry pick a lot of things.
Ascribing that collapse to one single cause often says more about the individual in question and their own concerns.
Good point.
Rather
for
than
Elon,
what actually happened.
Makes sense for
Elon,
Elon,
less of a
too.
single stunning cause and more like death by 1,000 cuts before, as the historian Guy Halsell phrases it, accidentally committing suicide, which is a much less exciting and a much less seductive answer.
Accidentally committing suicide, though, I think that still would... Doesn't that still seem like it would kind of reference a more single reason, though?
So, dealing with anything involving ancient population statistics is notoriously difficult due to a general lack of sources for this particular question. We do have, for example, fairly good records for the mid to late Republican period, but even this data is fraught with issues.
That's the Republican
period. The data
period.
is derived from the famous Roman census, which required, at least in theory, that Romans return to their hometowns and they report themselves when the census was being gathered.
Yeah.
The gist of the problem for the Republican period, and here I am drawing on a rather excellent book, Nathan Rosenstein's Rome at War, Farms, Families, and Death in the Middle Republic, is that there is a consistent fluctuation in the population of Italy as recorded in the census, which basically comes down to us via Livy, during the Second Punic War onwards.
So the census record's not very accurate, as I was saying, just because of the logistical nightmare that it would have been to actually collect that data. I mean, when Augustus does that, you just think about what type of operation that would have required to actually get an accurate census of the whole empire. I'd wondered how good that could actually be. I mean, we conduct those today, and I still feel like it's so hard. It would be so hard, not just logistically, just to get accurate information. But I guess, I mean, some information is better than no information. Now, they conducted these censuses too, not just so just to have the number of how many people are, but use that information to influence tax laws and influence how they govern.
From the end of the war in 201 BC until 164 BC, there is a general population increase as recorded in the census. From 164 BC until about 125 BC, the numbers are all over the place, and they jump by quite a bit during each census, far more than really should be expected.
Pre-empire.
Historical opinion is basically broken into two opposing camps, and just to reiterate, this is for when we do have good data by the standards of classical history that we are able to actually work with. And those two opposing camps are referred to as the high count and the low count, which have differing views on how accurate the census numbers are.
Interesting.
Essentially,
I wasn't sure. I guess I had thought into that depth about known how diverse that opinion was about the accuracy. I mean, I always just thought of like the logistics of it being difficult, and everyone takes it with a grain of salt. But there is, I guess, such these concerted camps that have come down on that info. All right, so Rome fans, what are you? A high count or a low count?
Was Italy over?
I think empires and stuff like that tend to fabricate a lot of things as well. So I don't know. Maybe I would be a low count, but that's not based after any statistical analysis by myself.
Populated or not. The bulk of the evidence seems now to favor the low count interpretation, which basically argues that the differences in the census are a result of citizens not reporting for years, which line up with rather costly wars fought outside Italy, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula, where casualties are potentially up to 40%.
And that's something, too, you would wonder, if you're going to hide certain numbers about certain things, it would be that people have died. Right, because that just is bad PR for your empire. If you're talking about how, these high percentages of dying in battle, so don't even count them as dead. They're still alive somewhere. That makes sense. And that's definitely great for propaganda. I've seen that in all of military history.
In other words, it's not that there was a decline in population in one year, and then in the next year there's some massive population spike, and then in the next there's a sharp drop. It's that people were deliberately not reporting to the census in order to avoid being called up for service in conflicts where casualties were high and where there was not much opportunity for plunder or booty.
Interesting. It's like when people don't register to vote so they don't get drafted.
The point here is that there are all these debates and disagreements when our evidence is actually fairly abundant, and much of that surviving evidence is probably incorrect as to the population of Italy during this period. It is even more difficult to have discussions like this for periods where our evidence for population records, such as the census, are even more sparse, like in late antiquity. There have been attempts to determine population numbers based on things like surviving records of the grain dole and how that changed over time.
Sure.
Because the grain dole was a perk given to citizens, and after the Antonine Constitution granted citizenship to all free men in the Roman Empire in the 200s, it might be able to be used as a placeholder for the census, but at the end of the day, in late antiquity, our evidence for this sort of thing simply is not as good as it is for the Republican period.
Sure, records of slaves as it pertains to total population is also going to be difficult. I mean, there was such a massive population of slaves in the Roman Empire. That becomes problematic in places where representation is going to be based on population, like you saw with it being such a debate in the early years of the United States. The grain thing would be something very documented since, you're going to tax based off of certain wealth. And Rome had just these very successful, especially in the early centuries, large plantations in very, very fertile regions of here in Western Europe, which allowed them to boom the way that they did.
With that in mind, there are some things we can definitely say about the population of the Roman Empire, and the historian Kyle Harper, in his book The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire, puts it as follows. Trying to reconstruct population levels in the ancient world is a crude business. It always has been. Already in the 1750s, David Hume and the Scottish divine Robert Wallace laid out arguments for wildly divergent views of the populousness of ancient nations. The debate has not always been so genial, but already in view were the outlines of a controversy that has continued down to the present day between high counters such as Wallace and low counters such as Hume. Even in recent times, credible voices have spoken in favor of peak numbers for the Roman imperial population ranging from 44 million to 100 million.
That's such a broad number. In fact, that Kyle Harper hypothesis I used for reference in the Fall of Rome video I did. I basically made a video specifically talking about the climate issues that happen in the Roman Empire and how that also is going to bring into crop production and the whole domino effect that happens there, as well as disease. Just things that probably aren't just talked about as much. People like to talk a lot more about like military or political decisions or that, but geography essentially.
Where there is broad agreement is around the fact that the populations within the empire grew in the 150 years after the death of Augustus and reached their maximal extent on the cusp of the Antonine Plague.
Yeah,
but absolute figures remain necessarily speculative. Though the debate between Hume and Wallace
Pax
carries on
Romana.
among modern scholars, the soundest arguments point us to believe that there were some 60 million inhabitants in the Roman Empire when Augustus died, and closer to 75 million a century and a half later when Galen first arrived in Rome. Estimates for late antiquity for both halves of the Roman Empire in total is perhaps somewhere around 50 million, maybe 45 million, maybe 55 million.
Maybe they were doing population counts based off of their amphitheaters. They're like, all right, they're not going to want to make the amphitheater too small or too big because they would waste money. So let's judge the population of a region by how many available seats there are.
It's not at all clear. No matter how you attempt to estimate the population, however, we do not have sufficient evidence that population decline was the reason for the end of the Roman Empire.
Sure.
Although this is not to say that it was not a factor. So, with that in mind,
you're still talking causes versus
what does the evidence
effects
that we do have actually point to? Well, there is a lot going on in late antiquity when it comes to climate change, plague, and political instability. But really, when you're talking about the end of the Roman Empire, what that really means is the decline and the eventual end of cities and the economic system that connected them all together. So, for the rest of this video, what I'm going to try and do is summarize the views of 3 historians on how this all fell apart, and those 3 are Guy Halsall, John Liebeschutz, and Chris Wickham, whose book, Framing the Early Middle Ages, has essentially become the consensus on what happened to the Western Roman Empire since its publication in 2005.
So about the Kyle Harper stuff, this stuff I think I've heard, but haven't looked into their thesis statements much. So this will be good to learn. So keep learning with me, y'all. Add anything you got to, any other research you got, you've heard about. Let's put all the pieces together, right?
The city was the key to Rome's political, social, and economic life. And in the late 5th century, many cities in the Western Empire were either abandoned or they were remarkably reduced in size, with full abandonment or severe shrinkage fully arriving in the early 6th century after the plague of Justinian and the wars of reconquest launched by the eastern half of the Roman Empire that ravaged Italy, Spain, and North Africa.
And you have to think too, like what brings people to cities in the first place? Small service-related industries, right? If you're like a farmer, you're not moving into cities unless you've been displaced, which happened, say from being pushed out by latifundia, but like, yeah, going into cities because of consolidation of land outside in the rural areas, that was an issue. The influx of people did bring civil problems inside of societies, as you know, people were consistently on the brink of starvation through the Roman Empire. You weren't very far, especially if you lived in a city. A lot of riots for breads and stuff like that. You heard the whole bread and circuses thing, right? It's like, take care of people's entertainment, give them something to eat, and they're yours, right? So, but cities are also going to be built on their interconnectivity as well, also with other cities. So trade routes, right? If that's not going through certain cities, then it bypasses you and it becomes dead. If people aren't traveling in those areas for whatever economic reasons, the city is going to die with it. Look at like little towns on Route 66 in the United States that all failed because things got diverted into other places. Eastern Rome, you know, is going to be dominating in trade. So you have trade routes and more people along those routes. And where connectivity is where jobs are, and people follow where jobs are.
The city essentially defined Rome's understanding of the world. It is, after all, where we get the word civilization. When conquering a new territory, the Roman state very consciously built itself into legitimacy by doing 2 things. The first is the literal construction of Roman civilization. Aqueducts, paved roads built in the Roman manner. A lot of
civil engineering.
Roman-style
maybe the greatest
walls,
ever.
as opposed to, say, Gallic-style fortifications, things of that nature. The second, arguably more important thing that they did was the implementation of what is called civic evergetism. Although sometimes you'll see it written as eugetism, it means the same thing. Local elites were co-opted into the Roman imperial project by being given a place in Roman society. Aristocrats served as the administrators of a given region, and while they may have had grandiose estates out in the country, they did their governing from the city center.
Classic empire building there. You have to get the aristocrats on your side to legitimize your power, right? And in return, of course, what you do is give them incredible amount of benefits like political power. Had to be of the patrician aristocratic class to be able to participate in government, at least as as an elected representative. Yep, right out of the handbook of how to build an empire. Get the bigwigs on your side.
It was their civic duty to stand for election, to serve on councils,
eliminate them
and to
or
use their wealth, much like the Roman
them.
state, to build themselves into legitimacy.
Right.
They were expected to construct amphitheaters, city streets, temples, things of that nature. This is the system of civic evergetism.
You know, that's like you can get some of that influence from like Alexander the Great, who did that. He was really into like building cities and, of course, not necessarily and running them, but like building them up. It's like, here is okay, we conquered some region. We're going to build up a city now, and it's going to have an agora, like in a market. It's going to have an amphitheater, gymnasium, places for political discourse, right? Schools. And he just dotted them all around there. Now he in a funny way, named him Alexandropolis, or Alexandria, but yeah, you definitely see that legacy with Rome, city building, right?
It enabled the Roman state to operate with what we today would understand to be a small central government. Under this system, cities flourished, but it did not last. In the 3rd century, there were a series of civil wars, plagues, and incursions from Rome's neighbors on the frontiers, the so-called barbarians, as well as the Persian Empire. Right. Collectively, this is what is known as the 3rd century
Persian Empire
crisis.
from the east, though. Yeah.
Territory was lost, cities shrank in size, and the population did decline.
Right.
By the time the Roman Empire got back on its feet, the state had strengthened significantly, and both the nature and function of the aristocracy and the cities had fundamentally changed in order to respond to these challenges. The historian Guy Halsall, in his book Barbarian Migrations in the Roman West, 376 to 568, writes the following. Administratively, the basic building block of the empire remained the civitas, the city district, although there were some modifications to these. More important changes took place at higher levels. The provinces were drastically reduced in size to make their government easier, and their number doubled, eventually to 114. This obviously raised some cities to the status of provincial capitals. Other towns declined in relative importance. The provinces were then grouped into dioceses, each ruled by a vicarius, and by an uneven process during the reigns of Constantine I and his sons, the dioceses were in turn grouped into praetorian prefectures. There were 2 in the regions that concern us, Gaul and Italy. Rome remained as the urban prefecture. All the rulers of these different regions had their own administrative staffs. Atop this administrative pyramid stood the emperor and his palatine officials. At the court were located the officials of the bedchamber, the financial ministries, the corps of notaries, the imperial writing offices, the agentes and rebus, and so on. These totaled a veritable army, especially when added to the imperial bodyguards. Lactantius and other writers bemoaned the ever-increasing number of bureaucrats, and understandably. The late Roman imperial service has been estimated at between 25,000 and 35,000 men. The growth in the number of provinces, the institution of 2 intermediate administrative levels between them and the emperor, and above all, the uncoupling of military and civil service, effectively ended the danger of revolt from provincial governors. Mm-hmm. The separation of the 2 branches of imperial service was especially important. Henceforth, governors would not command troops within their territories, and military commanders would not control the supply of food and pay to their soldiers. Furthermore, military districts like the Saxon Shore or the Tractus Armoricanus no longer corresponded to civil administrative units.
It's famously been said that, how the Romans overexpanded, and then administration becomes difficult. It also becomes expensive, and it also becomes less and less tied to any kind of civil service, back to this entity that is Rome, a place that so many people in the Roman Empire will never go to in their entire lives. It doesn't necessarily feel some kind of allegiance to in some way. Further you are, the longer time goes. Remember, Rome is an empire. It's a diversity of subject peoples. But the overexpansion, definitely is going to hit the civil administration system. Diocletian understood this when he's going to split the empire, which is going to set them on different paths.
The importance of rank, status, and precedence in the later Roman world cannot be overestimated. Traditionally, there had been only two aristocratic orders, the equestrian and the senatorial. Constantine added a third, the comitiva, the emperor's companions, in other words, those who had risen through imperial service. The equestrian order was divided into grades of precedence, the egregi, the perfectissimi, and the eminentissimi. The senatorial order had originally been made up simply of clarissimi. The comitiva was subdivided into three
Seems so
grades.
arbitrary, doesn't it?
Within all groups were complex rules of precedence depending upon whether a rank had been bestowed personally by the emperor or in absentia, or whether an honoris actually held a requisite office or had been bestowed an honorary title, such as ex vicarius. Imperial service
love our
brought
honorary
entry
titles
into
in
the
history.
equestrian
Make everybody
order, or
happy,
the
right?
comitiva, and as the 4th century progressed, the inflation of honors set in so that offices that had carried equestrian status brought senatorial rank. The equestrian order and the comitiva were devalued, and the former more or less disappeared. The senatorial order expanded so that extra honorific grades had to be created. The spectabiles, the illustres, and the gloriosi.
You see this in the Middle Ages too, when power becomes so decentralized, and during the centralizing of power once again in in Europe, so I would like the Holy Roman Empire, just throwing out honorary titles to everyone to basically make them happy. They're just like making up names of stuff, and you to feel good about yourself and think that the superiors above you are kind and they're giving you something in the end. You know what I mean? It's like fake power.
Eventually, the rank of clarissimus became a mere title. A leading senator's son was automatically a clarissimus, but he needed to serve in the higher echelons of imperial service at any time, and at the higher levels, most were not held for more than a year or two. By the end of the 4th century, command of a regiment or the governorship of a province brought entry into the clarissimate. It has been estimated that about 3,000 jobs per generation in each half of the empire brought senatorial status. Some aristocrats possessed enormous wealth, but this meant little in politics, even within their class, without the imperial service that guaranteed an honorific title and a higher place in precedence.
See, there you get the cycle of where does my power come? It comes from someone else. And where does their power come from? It comes from me. You can basically see the elements of feudalism developing here before all of this is going to collapse. But that will just fly through the Middle Ages.
Furthermore, traditional Roman aristocratic culture required periods, however brief, of service between spells of otium on one's estates. The bureaucracy, moreover, provided aristocrats with opportunities to exercise their own patronage by placing people in post within it, even when themselves not serving the state in an official capacity. As Averell Cameron has stated, the 4th century witnessed the transformation of the old orders, still closely linked to birth and wealth, into a service aristocracy in which rank depended upon office. The precise way in which this linked regional elites into the empire varied. In some areas, an aristocrat would, in local or regional socioeconomic terms, have been an aristocrat with or without the existence of the empire.
Any kind of natural social mobility.
In others, it might have been the opportunities provided by imperial service that raised an individual or his family above the others in the locality.
Seems like it's almost impossible to understate the power of family in Roman society. Your family was everything. Your family name carried so much about what your life is going to be and how you are going to be treated. It was a strong patriarchal society, again, with family. What is your family name, Just dominated everything.
These variations made the empire a socially and politically more variegated entity than is often appreciated, and are decisive in explaining the fate of different regions in the 5th century and later. Continuing a trend begun during the 3rd century, the emperors adopted a more autocratic governmental style. They also moved the political core of the empire to the geographical periphery.
Right.
Through the reigns of Maximian, Constantine and his sons, of the usurper Magnentius, of Julian as Caesar in Gaul, and into those of Valentinian I and Gratian, the emperor was to be found, as often as not, in the far north of Gaul at Trier or on the Rhine-Danube frontier itself. The other imperial capitals were places like Sirmium in Pannonia and Antioch in the east. Even the great new city of Constantinople was indicative of this trend. This made much strategic sense. There was a great deal of movement within the enormous pyramid of interlocking patronage networks that was the bureaucracy, and thus a vast store of patronage for the emperors, their higher officials, and powerful noblemen to acquire, distribute, and redistribute.
So out there saying that was like this patronage was just bigger and I don't know, more robust in the East. I would have thought it would have been in the West, at least originally. But I mean, by the time Constantine comes around, so much of the power has already shifted. So I don't know, maybe I already answered my question.
The problem which should be stressed was that although the system served effectively to bind the different regions of the Western Empire back into a single political unit, and thus replace early Roman municipal service and competition comparatively well, it was nevertheless somewhat passive. Early Roman regional elites worked to associate themselves with the empire. The interest in imperial service lay in what the empire could provide. Put another way, in the late Roman Empire, aristocrats ceased to ask what they could do for their empire, and instead increasingly asked what their empire could do for them.
Sure. I mean, what they can do from them is just protect their property, right? You're an aristocrat because the state that you can, the only people that you can really compete with you, because they control military and stuff like that. It's that symbiotic relationship I was telling you about. You need their validation, or at least if you're an aristocrat, you're smart if you do that.
So, a rather extended quote, but it sums up the changes to the government in response to the 3rd century crisis rather well. These alterations to Roman social structure and the role of the aristocracy in the late Roman Empire not only strengthened the government and enabled it to respond more effectively to the challenges of late antiquity, it also profoundly affected the cities, and this is where we get to the Roman economy. The single factor which defines the economy of the Roman Empire, more than anything else, especially in late antiquity, is the easy transport of bulk goods. These are things like olive oil, wine, flax, lumber, brick, and of course, pottery. There are essentially two views that scholars take on the Roman economy. There is the primitivist view, which holds that the Roman economy was fundamentally different than ours, and there is the modernist or substantivist view, which argues the opposite, essentially that for all the differences which exist between then and now.
Well, the larger your empire is too, the more you're going to need to move goods. You have different climates, you have different strengths and weaknesses of things that they contribute. So a place that might not grow a lot of grain, you got to get that stuff sent up there, right? Romans understood that. They knew it. Invested so much in their road system, and of course with aqueducts, which helps the cities get big anyways. A reason why their cities were so much bigger, they were able to artificially add resources like water through complex engineering.
The economy of ancient Rome was fundamentally like ours today. Over the past several decades, the modernist view has largely won out, and that is because the economy of ancient Rome was, like the one we are so familiar with today, an economy driven largely by markets and prices.
Sure.
Our surviving sources not only text.
Now that did bring a lot of times a lot of problems. There became inflation. It was a major thing that Diocletian needed to answer to, and so he was going to be setting prices and stuff like that. So it took the good and the bad with it. Now to say that this was just some like capitalist society or something, it's taken maybe a step too far. We can see they experienced the pros and cons of that over their time.
But also material, that is archaeological, paint a pretty clear picture. Rome's economy, especially in late antiquity, was market-based and saw intensive rationalism all across the empire. Some regions produced vast amounts of olives and olive oil, other places produced wine, other places produced finished goods, and there are plenty of archaeological remains of pottery factories, for instance. There was also a healthy mix of large estates run by aristocrats which engaged in the production of one or two goods, like olive oil, and smaller farms run by families which exist up until the end of the 5th century, or in Italy, until the end of the 6th century, but by and large, it was the big estates of the wealthy which were characteristic of the Roman market economy.
And it makes sense. We're going to have these large like plantations or whatever it is, or even cities or something that focus on the development of one product. Now that can be good and bad. You can make you a lot of money, but you are totally at the mercy of market factors. So if you're in a place, again, that produces one thing, olive oil, whatever it is, but then all of a sudden demand for that thing is it ends for one reason or another, that whole city is going under, which is mean people are going to leave. Think of like the cars, right? Car manufacturing in Detroit, when it collapsed about 20 years ago, started collapsing about 20 years ago, mass exodus of people. They weren't in those jobs anymore. kind of becomes a ghost town. That happened. It looked like for Detroit could have been heading in that direction for a while and fortunately rebounded. But having that kind of balanced economy is good for the people themselves that live there. May not necessarily be as good for the whole empire, because they would love if one place could just mass produce something that is in high demand, but it puts you at a lot of risk, which if you're going to keep getting that specialization in the Roman Empire does make it very vulnerable to massive population and demographic changes.
Especially in late antiquity. Both which were characteristic of the Roman market economy, especially in late antiquity. Both cities and the Roman state and the security which the state provided were heavily intertwined, and it's basically impossible to understand one without the other for this particular subject. Roman cities functioned as economic nodes and regional centers for the transport of low-value bulk goods, and they functioned as centers of tax collection.
Right.
The Roman state, essentially through the military,
empires love trade because you can tax
security and built and maintained the famous road network of the Roman Empire to enable its armies to travel across Roman territory.
Even places that don't have big cities love trade. Say like the Mongols. The Mongols loved trade. One big reason is why is they could tax it.
That security enabled costs for these goods to be relatively low because there was no fear of goods being stolen. And it is that security and the ease of transport which knit the Roman world together so tightly.
Protect your traders.
The state also provided a system of insurance and contract law which private merchants could use to insure their own business ventures against any sort of a potential loss.
By protection of those roads too. Sounds a lot like the Mongol Empire as well. As when they took over the Silk Road, they went to incredible extensive efforts to protect it with laws, rest areas, military protection, etc.
Much like we have today. And then, spanning the Mediterranean Sea and connecting all of the coastal cities and towns were shipping lanes, which were absolutely crucial to the Roman economy for the following reason.
Well, yeah. Egypt, especially Egypt, coming out of Egypt, if you're talking about them connecting north-south across the Mediterranean, such a big deal. Got all the food, the grains, the breadbasket.
The Roman Empire was, to paraphrase historian Chris Wickham, united by the tax system that funded everything from the military to road systems to ports to the procurement of bulk goods for the military, and for the Annona system, which is essentially how large cities in classical antiquity were able to feed themselves.
And will be a reason for their downfall as well, over taxation, right? The bigger you are, the more complex things are, the more expensive things are going to be. And for regular people, those tax burdens become very difficult. And in a classical move in history too, is if you aren't going to tax a lot of the wealthy because you want them on your side politically, it puts a lot more burden on the lower classes. Saw that in lead up to, say, like the French Revolution, for example, as they were not taxing their wealthy elites.
It's a slightly different idea, but you basically see the same sort of thing in Han China.
So if you don't do that, then you're going to have to just go conquer and force and conquer to get wealth to fund your empire. And that can lead to collapse too, as the Romans saw.
Themselves. It's a slightly different idea, but you basically see the same sort of thing in Han China as regards rights to feed the cities. Now, in order to move the tax,
China,
both
great
in
contemporaries
money and
with
in
the
kind,
Romans,
where that was applicable, the Roman state subsidized private shipping, a group of merchants called navicularii. Essentially, the way the system worked was that the state contracted out a specified amount of tonnage on the ships to carry the goods or money. Coins do take up space, after all. And these merchants would then travel to the specified city to bring the tax. Once that was done, they could travel anywhere else they wanted, but what this does, essentially, is it enables bulk goods that were not part of the tax system to reach the cities with low transaction costs, because the cost of moving the ship and everything on it was partially subsidized by the Roman state.
Interesting. That's where you don't have real free markets. A lot of government intervention here. Subsidies, privileges.
Goods were cheap, is the main idea here. To sum everything up then, what are we looking at? Well, the Roman economy was agrarian at its base, and much of its day-to-day functioning was predicated upon the supply and demand principle, where low-value goods, produced and traded in high quantities across vast distances, traveled along roads and shipping routes maintained by the Roman state for military use, by a mix of government officials, private merchants, and individuals who operated in both worlds, backed by complex legal systems and financed by bank loans, because the Romans had a fairly sophisticated system of banking,
Right.
utilizing a revitalized money economy.
Right.
We should be very clear here that there was a decline in late antiquity from the empire's population peak circa AD 200, perhaps as much as 15 or 20% of a decline. But while there were less people, comparatively speaking, the 4th century was one of renewed construction all across the Roman world, and the introduction of new coinage drastically increased the monetization of the economy.
Sure. There was a big rebound that you saw there late, and unfortunately it didn't last long, but Rome saw, it was really bouncing back, it seemed like.
Especially because much of the new coinage was based in gold, with silver as a secondary. The result was that the Roman world of late antiquity was far more deeply integrated than it was during the Augustan era, and this new aristocracy, which I talked about
still growing
in this
then,
video,
too.
because they were so deeply tied to the Roman government and the economy, were able to take advantage of this drastic upsurge in monetization. The result, long term, was that the basis of wealth shifted in late antiquity from land to physical money. Infrastructure expanded and was repaired in order to facilitate the movement of bulk goods all across the Roman world.
It's pretty much a natural progression of economics. You go from pretty much barter economies, short distance, small scale, just good for good type of trades. But then as you expand and you want to make trade more efficient, you use money. We use money because it's efficient. It's easy to move. It's easy to carry, right? See a lot of empires do this. But it can, with that ease of access and ease of just efficiency in general, can leave you very vulnerable to inflation. In instances in history, it's also been difficult for for many people to accept new forms of currency as they don't trust them. You saw that in ancient China when they were shifting to paper money to make it more efficient to be able to make and to be able to use than using, metal as currency or those type of materials. It really enters into your economy a new element of trust, which can be very, very fragile.
Kyle Harper sums it up like this. The monetary restoration revived the financial sector. The great banks of the Roman Empire had all but vanished with the crash of the silver money regime, but in the 4th century they came back to life. The evidence for credit and banking in the 4th century exceeds that for any period of Roman history. Nothing from antiquity can match in vividness the priest John Chrysostom's portrait of the deposit bankers of Antioch at work in his day. Credit markets fueled capital investment and underwrote
big trade region
ventures.
in Antioch.
They turned the wheels of commerce. The merchant who wants to get rich prepares a ship, hires sailors, summons a captain, and does all the other things necessary to set sail, and borrows money and tries the sea, and passes into foreign lands. The revival of money and credit reawakened commercial networks across the Mediterranean. St. Augustine, in his port town of Hippo, evoked the allure of the trading life. Sailing and trading, another says, that's great. It's great to know many provinces, make money everywhere, not to be beholden in town to some mighty man, to always travel in foreign lands and nourish the mind on a variety of business and nations, and then come home, rich with profits.
So you're talking about the eastern half of the Roman Empire there, again, which is so much on trade. It connects the Silk Road trade route, stuff coming from Asia, coming from Europe, coming through Africa. These areas in and around Antioch, it's their entire economy. It's what you would see. Now go into the fields and the plantations of some of the plains of Italy. More in France, you might get a different kind of perspective. You might get a different analysis as they have very different economic realities. But one based on currency, one based off of material resources.
There isn't any reason really to suppose that the Roman Empire would have fallen in the 5th century if things had not gone awry. Indeed, some historians view the 4th century as the high point of the empire.
This is like I call the Band-Aid sort of period. You got that with Constantine, you got it with Diocletian and Constantine, the reform emperors, the ones that were trying the best they can to kind of fix the wounds and heal the instability of Rome, but they're putting Band-Aids on a wound that needs surgery or the limb needs to be cut off. But it did delay the collapse of the empire as a whole, for sure. Great bounce back period.
Crucial difference being that in the historians view the 4th century as the high point of the empire, with the crucial difference being that in the eastern half, The cities and urban elites were more important to the functioning of the state, while in the western half of the empire, which is typically what people mean when they refer to the fall of Rome,
Right.
the service aristocracy, at home on their big estates and engaged in the pursuit of profit, for which the cities were so key, were the more important factor in imperial governance. So what happened? Well, it's not population collapse. It seems to be a combination of political intrigue distracting the Roman court from military events, and a rather severe blow to this heavily interconnected economy. Everyone watching this video is probably...
And he takes into Kyle Harper stuff about climate disease, right? And the freaking Huns, man. Domino effect of people fleeing Eastern and Northern Europe into the Roman heartland.
Heavily interconnected economy. Everyone watching this video is probably familiar in some fashion with the barbarian invasions of late antiquity.
Right.
There is not really a one-size-fits-all answer for how this occurred. There is at least one known instance of what we would consider to be mass migration or an invasion. And this is the crossing of the Danube by some of the Goths in 376. The Angles, Saxons, and Utes probably fit into this scheme as well.
And you know about the Hun invasions coming into the Eastern Europe too, which saw people fleeing to the west, especially from these Eastern European areas. A little bit different for the Angles and those people, but again, domino effect.
But while there were large-scale population movements across the Channel to the British Isles, it was drawn out over maybe 2 centuries, whereas the Goths crossed possibly as many as 50,000 people in one go.
Right.
What concerns us here for the end of the Western Empire are the Vandals. The date has been debated. It's either 405 or 406, although an extremely good article by the historian Michael Kolakowski does argue for 406. But no matter which year you pick, a large group of barbarians, including Sueves and Vandals, crossed the Rhine, supposedly because it was so cold that winter that the Rhine had frozen over.
Climate.
We know extremely little about this. There are, and I am not exaggerating, like 3 sources for this event, one of which is just a line in a larger text, but they appear to have stayed in Gaul for up to 3 years. And then, possibly by as late as 409, they crossed into Iberia. The Visigoths, who were Roman allies by this point and who largely comprised the military in southern Gaul.
Yeah, you brought up one of the key things, especially when it comes to the military, is the Romans would conscript amongst foreign people, little enemy inside the gates kind of thing, which don't have a loyalty to the politics of Rome, but to their own interests and their own leaders and their own prerogatives, I guess. But again, we're just getting to that time period. Rome is so expanded and so old now. Loyalties are becoming less and less of a thing that can actually keep the empire together, if it ever did, really. But as the Romans gave legal rights to a lot of conquered people, which kind of just may not make them feel any kind of like personal connection, but at least, to Rome itself, but at least find themselves as players in the system.
Follow them into Iberia, and they defeat these groups in several battles. Over the course of the 420s, the situation flips, and the Vandals and the Sueves are able to defeat forces sent against them, and they are secure in southern Iberia.
Again, you're talking to a lot of vast lands of plantations and all that. You're going to be able to bounce around pretty quickly. There are cities here, but not like what we're seeing in the places that don't have these, lines of migrations and invasions.
Between 425 and 429, the Western Roman court
was where the food is, by the way.
Political intrigue, almost on a Game of Thrones type of level. This results in the Western government being distracted. And taking advantage of that distraction, the Vandals, led by their king Gaiseric, at some point during these 4 years, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and they successfully invade and conquer much of North Africa.
Also a very important economic region for growth.
Both halves of the Roman Empire launched several campaigns to retake North Africa in the 5th century, but this does not ever work. The loss of Iberia and North Africa is what, in the long term, does in the Western Roman Empire, although the effects are not felt all at once. The reason for this, essentially, is that Iberia and North Africa formed the spine of the tax system, which enabled everything else to function, and once this spine was snapped, the Western Roman Empire just basically starts hemorrhaging money. One of the methods by which the state could get troops for the military was by requesting the aristocracy to send peasants tied to their vast estates for a period of military service. However, those same aristocrats could get out of this by sending a certain amount of money to the state in exchange for keeping the peasants on their land. After the loss of Iberia and North Africa over the next few decades, requests for troops from these estates increase, but it's not actually to get soldiers. It's done in an attempt to get money to offset the losses of the tax system.
Right.
This was so crucial to the functioning of the Roman state that even as late as 471, the government was trying to figure out how to retake Iberia to recover at least a portion of that tax system. As all of this is happening, two things begin occurring in increasing frequency. The first is government coups, which decrease political stability. The second thing is the settling of barbarian troops, whom we don't really have much of a reason to think of as being disloyal to the Roman state. Hugh Elton wrote a whole book on this in the 90s.
Maybe not disloyal, but not necessarily loyal. Think that'd be fair to say?
Reason to think of as being disloyal to the Roman state. Hugh Elton wrote a whole book on this in the 90s. And these troops are being settled in various places in Western territory where they are promised something called thirds.
The Roman military are also basically mercenaries. They were paid, which is also why it became so expensive to maintain the military. That they want money. They want their extensive and very nice like retirement packages, which usually involved like a plot of land, which was a reason why they had to conquer so much too, is because the more you conquer, the more you're going to need soldiers. And the more soldiers you're going to need, the more land you're going to need. Therefore, you're going to need to conquer more. Vicious cycle.
The Visigoths are the first to have this occur. We don't know when exactly, but it's probably around 419. It's not entirely clear what thirds refers to, but the major argument put forth by a historian named Walter Goffart is that it doesn't refer to a third of land, but rather to a third of a region's tax revenue, which would have gone to the military after being allocated by the central government. In light of all the problems Rome was facing, settling the military in a region just cuts out the middleman, that is to say, the central Roman government. The military is able to just collect it from the surrounding area. So what this then leads to is a general breakdown in the economy of the Western Empire. The shipping lanes are disrupted, the easy movement of bulk goods disappear, and the cities gradually begin shrinking or are actually abandoned.
It's like in the end, these invasions, I guess hoping to get money or something, actually ends up having the opposite effect, ironically.
Things fall into disrepair and they aren't fixed, and local fighting begins to increase. Those aristocrats who I talked about at the start of this video and the military stop needing the Western Empire as a political entity, and local ties between them and the population gradually become more important.
They don't need the political entity. The Western aristocrats don't. I mean, again, it was what had protected their land was the state and protected their political positions too. But that being replaced by money and currency, maybe I didn't follow that strong enough.
Ties between them and the population gradually become more important, eventually leading to what the historian Peter Brown, probably the Dean of Late Antiquity, calls in his book The Rise of Western Christendom the development of localized Romes. And with the destruction of the tax spine, and with it the gradual decay of the Roman economy, by the time the barbarian Odovaker overthrew Romulus Augustulus and sent the imperial regalia to the eastern court at Constantinople, there was not a need for an emperor in the west anymore. One emperor in the east.
Maybe less of a need, but it was just, it had less power, I guess, right?
There was not a need for an emperor in the west anymore. One emperor in the east would suffice. The loss of North Africa due to political infighting and the distractions they caused was an accident which came on top of hundreds of wounds suffered by the Roman state as the emperors and the military attempted to put the state back together again. And Guy Halsall sums up the paradox of Rome's fall like this. 4 years after Romulus's deposition, in 480, evidently while plotting a campaign to restore his authority in Italy, Julius Nepos was murdered by 2 retainers, apparently at the instigation of the Bishop of Salona, that same Glycerius whom he had deposed and driven into the church 6 years earlier, and Odovaker took over Dalmatia. With his assassination, the empire in the west finally came to an end. It is, as often been noted, more than a little ironic that its last two rulers shared names with the first king of Rome, Romulus,
That is,
and if not the
I always
first
found that
emperor,
interesting too.
then the founder of the first imperial dynasty.
Rome founded by Romulus. Romulus, the name of the last emperor. It is so ironic.
Julius. The most ironic thing of all, however, is that during the preceding century, it is almost impossible to identify a single figure who had actually tried to cause its demise. All the decisive acts in bringing down the empire were carried out by people attempting to create a better position for themselves within the sorts of imperial structures that had existed in the 4th century. In a famous dictum, Andreas Pijanol wrote that Roman civilization did not die a natural death, it was assassinated. Neither alternative seems correct.
By who?
The Roman Empire was not murdered, nor did it die a natural death. It accidentally committed suicide.
So wondering with that, if you want to relate it to like a suicide. Suicide is tied to a specific person with a specific event. There wasn't a decision that brought them down, which is what suicide entails. All right, so in short, Elon, there are a lot of reasons, and it's complicated. There's economics, there's military stuff going on, there's political stuff. We have climate, we have disease, we have all of the things. But I know if you watch this, you already knew that and probably wanted to just come in and just hear those ideas or maybe kind of regurgitate some of those ideas. I guess where the biggest debate, though, is if you want to break down the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire down into percentages of like a pie chart, you know, which of the different elements of its fall commands the largest sort of piece of the pie. If you want to do that, let me know. Give me your percentages down below. Which part comes to, again, the military, economy, disease, whatever it is. That's probably where the biggest debate is, the most accurate debate, not just it was caused by depopulation. Again, I think it still comes back to that being an effect, not a cause. All right, guys. What do you guys think? Again, make sure you supported the original video with the Historian's Craft. That link is down below. Make sure to sub to their channel. I've got a fun little short video on Fall of Rome, especially with Kyle Harper's ideas about climate and disease. I'll link that down below. We'll see y'all next time. Bye.